Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Together, we'll be building a section of an aircraft carrier to display my F-14, so stick around and make sure you've subscribed to my channel for more content. Let's get started. We need to cut out the individual parts of the kit and assemble them. The kit consists of several large sections which fit together much like a puzzle. We'll begin by carefully trimming the support plastic with a hobby knife, and once that's done, each piece can be glued into its proper place. Especially with larger parts, it's important to first check if everything fits together properly. On the underside, I'm using superglue to give the entire structure more stability. Noticeable gaps have formed between the individual parts. These will be filled with sprue goo, a mixture of Tamiya extra thin cement and small plastic bits. Once dried, it fills the gaps perfectly and behaves almost like the original plastic from the kit. To smooth everything out, I'll use a rotary tool, which will remove the surface texture, but we'll address that later on. Time for the primer. As you can see, some of the gaps are still slightly visible. However, in the next step, we'll apply anti-slip texture from Ammo MIG, which will make those gaps almost invisible. The paste also restores the texture often seen on aircraft carrier surfaces, giving it that authentic look. I've also divided the surface into individual panels, marked with 1mm masking tape. While this might not be entirely realistic, I believe it creates a visually appealing effect in the final result. Once the texture has dried, it's time for some pre-shading. Random patterns in light grey tones are sprayed onto the individual panels, creating subtle variations that will show through later. Additionally, a black shade is sprayed into the panel lines to emphasize them, giving the structure more depth and definition. Now, the main color can be sprayed on. It should be heavily thinned and applied in layers, allowing the pre-shading effect to subtly show through. I admit I overdo it a bit here, so later I'll add a touch of gray in certain areas to bring the effect back and enhance the contrast once more. Instead of using the provided decals, I'm airbrushing the runway markings myself. However, I didn't account for the texture, which prevents the masking tape from fully adhering to the surface. This causes the paint to leak slightly, resulting in uneven lines. In hindsight, it would have been smarter to apply the markings with a chipping sponge instead of the airbrush to avoid the leaking. After sealing the work so far with a glossy varnish, which has dried for 24 hours, we can begin the weathering process. Small drops of heavily thinned enamel paint are applied and gently smudged with a flat brush. Later, I'll use the same paint to create splatter effects, and I'll add tire marks using a stencil. Unfortunately, I didn't record that part, so I can only describe it to you, but you'll be able to see it clearly in the final result. Oil paints can also be used for weathering. Small dots are applied and then blended with a brush dipped in odorless thinner, a technique commonly known as an oil dot filter. This method creates a subtle, layered grime effect, adding depth and character to the surface, making it look aged and well used. So far, so good. Now we can turn our attention to the jet blast deflector. one of the highlights that will stand out clearly in our diorama. The backside is quite lacking in detail. To fix this, I'm adding 3D printed bolts. I use a bit of masking tape as a spacer, and at each corner I punch a small hole where the bolts will be glued in place. It's a real Sisyphean task. After many hours, nearly 500 bolts have finally been attached. Not perfect, but certainly better than nothing. At last, the primer can be applied. Once that's done, we'll move on to pre-shading again, much like we did with the deck panels earlier. The goal here is to create subtle depth, with random dark and light patches that will peek through the final paint layers, giving the Deflector a weathered, battle-hardened appearance. The smaller components of the Deflector can also be detailed and weathered. Each piece will receive the same attention to detail, ensuring they blend seamlessly into the overall weathered look of the diorama. After letting the wash dry for about 40 minutes, it can be removed with a sponge. For more stubborn areas, Odorless thinner can be used, though care must be taken not to strip away the underlying paint. Before applying the wash, of course, all parts were sealed with a glossy varnish, but even that can only withstand so much thinner before it starts to break down. The corners of this piece are further highlighted with oil paint, which is skillfully blended and shaped using a deerfoot stippler brush. This technique creates rich, textured shadows and highlights, adding depth and giving the deflector a rugged, worn appearance. The subtle strokes mimic the wear and tear you'd expect from years of service on a bustling aircraft carrier. At this point, thinned enamel paint is once again dabbed onto the surface. After letting it dry for about 10 minutes, a brush dipped in the appropriate thinner is used to work the paint into the details, creating the desired level of grime and weathering. Since the paint is heavily diluted, this process needs to be repeated a few times to achieve the right effect, slowly building up layers of subtle dirt and wear. corners, oil paint can be used once more to intensify the effect. By carefully blending the oils into the recesses, the grime appears deeper and more pronounced, giving the impression of accumulated dirt and wear in these often overlooked areas. This adds an extra layer of realism to the weathering process. The same process is now applied to the backside of the deflector shield. Layer by layer, thinned enamel paint is dabbed on and worked in with a brush, followed by oil paints in the corners to enhance the depth of the weathering. This ensures the entire piece has a consistent, realistic, worn look from every angle. The deflector can now be installed, though it turned out to be more complicated than expected. In the end, everything holds together nicely. Keen observers will also have noticed that I added some chipping to the edges and lightly sprayed enamel paint for additional weathering effects, giving it that extra touch of realism. Before we reach the final result, there are still a few smaller details to complete, like building this aircraft tug. It's a small but crucial addition that will bring more life and authenticity to the overall scene. This thing has gaps wider than the Grand Canyon, which will need to be filled with putty. It's a bit of a challenge, but once the gaps are smoothed out, the tug will look much more cohesive and ready for the diorama. Once the paint has been applied and sealed with a glossy varnish, the decals can be added. The decals are soaked in lukewarm water for about 30 seconds until they release from the backing paper. The desired surface is brushed with microset, and the decal is carefully positioned. After letting it dry for about 10 minutes, microsol is applied over the decal to help it conform tightly to the surface, creating that perfect painted-on look. Once dry, another layer of glossy varnish is sprayed on. Then, the edges of the decal are carefully sanded with wet sandpaper, around 6,000 grit, to remove the top film. A final coat of glossy varnish is applied, and the painted-on effect is complete. At last, all the pieces can take their final place on the diorama, starting with the F-14, the star of the show. A few carefully painted figures are also ready to be positioned, bringing the scene to life. Each element, from the jet to the crew, adds another layer of realism, capturing a moment frozen in time on the deck of this miniature carrier. And here it is, the final result. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to see more, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. I truly appreciate every comment, and I'll do my best to respond to each one. Let me know what you think of this build. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care and happy modeling.